USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Week in Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to the USCHO Weekend Review podcast for Sunday, March 3rd, 2019. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. This podcast is sponsored by the NCAA Frozen Four, April 11th and 13th at KeyBank Center in Buffalo. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. Well, it was a crazy couple of nights in college hockey, Jim. And why don't we start out with what seemed to be some major acts of violence or tempers getting up or whatever. The first thing that jumps out at me is what I saw when I got home and started going through Twitter. And that was the hit delivered by Arizona State's Jacob Wilson.
And that one was pretty violent. And in terms of hits, I had mentioned to you, I saw a hit out at Mercyhurst a few weeks ago in their game against ASC. I thought that was one of the most violent hits I had seen all year. And that one with Wilson last night on Sampo Ranto, that was really uncalled for, violent. And it's going to have ramifications. That is Arizona State's last game until their first game of the NCAA tournament. Wilson was assessed a game disqualification, so that's an automatic one-game suspension. And as you and I were discussing off the air, people say, oh, well, they have no conference to suspend him. The WCHA is handling officiating and discipline for Arizona State this year. So WCHA will actually have the opportunity to review that hit and potentially give him more than one game, possibly put him out for the regionals entirely if they were to play both games, or maybe even more. And if there's more than whatever's left in the season, that will carry on to next season. He'll be out for the first game of next year. That's where this discipline process goes. It's kind of a little crazy that it could get like that, but those are the types of hits that have no place in the game of college hockey.
Well, they certainly don't. And it's been a point of emphasis along the way where they need to have teams dial that back. Even so, I still see games where there are contact to the head penalties that should be called that are not. It's awfully hard, even with two referees out there watching, to see everything that goes on, especially stuff away from the play. This certainly wasn't away from the play.
No, I mean, it's right on the puck carrier. But and you can say that Ranto had his head down, all that stuff. But the player for Arizona State, Wilson, left his feet. He wasn't just trying to stand a guy up at the blue line. He was trying to hurt that player. And maybe you can say that, he feels remorseful for whatever. You're responsible for your actions on the ice. And the way he left his feet and leapt at that player, that's a real dangerous play. And people on social media, I know some media members last night were kind of really up in arms when they saw the video. They said this should be more than just one game if it does get to that. I don't know if that's right, but that he's getting at least a one-game suspension from this. And this is the NHL. That's probably 5 to 10 games, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Well, things got a little bit feisty between Quinnipiac and Yale. USCHO's game of the week. Some disqualifications, some majors handed out there.
Yeah, and again, this is now this was the last game of the regular season for both of these teams, and now they're going to have some consequences in the playoffs because of what happened. It started about the midway point of the game. There was a scrum in front of the net, and Chase Prisky, who has been a fantastic player for Quinnipiac, considered a Hobie Baker finalist possibility, but I don't think that when you look at the character part that he's going to stand up on the character, ends up knocking down a Yale player, and while the player was on the ice, kicked him and visibly kicked him in something that was very easy to see, and the referee in excellent position to see it. He immediately gave him the 5-minute major for kicking and a game disqualification. So Prisky, minimally of one game, will miss at least the first game of Quinnipiac's quarterfinal series 2 weeks from now. And then you add on later in that game, about 9 minutes left, a fight between Luke Shiplow and Anthony Walsh from Quinnipiac and Yale, respectively. Each of those players got game disqualifications. So both of them will miss their first playoff game. Again, quarterfinal game for Quinnipiac. For Yale, it will be next week in the opening round of the ECAC playoffs. But I mean, Quinnipiac, they had an injured defenseman coming in, one of their top six. Now they've lost two more of their top six defensemen for at least one game of the playoffs. That it's just not smart. I understand tempers get flared, and that's kind of a heated series. I think want to call it a rivalry or just some real animosity, between those two schools. It exists, and tempers got the best. There were two more misconducts handed out later in the game. So the total penalties were, I believe, 91 minutes in the game. Quinnipiac, they're the winners, and they end up with 52 of those 91 minutes. So just cooler heads did not prevail a lot last night. And, it becomes a little bit crazy. But what players just seem to lose is the perspective that this is not just impacting them on that game. It's now going to impact them into the postseason.
And in the case of Prisky, we haven't seen anything come out from the ECAC Hockey League office as we are recording this on Sunday afternoon, and that might not even come out until Monday if there is one. But that kind of an egregious call, that kind of an egregious infraction probably is worthy of an extra game or two on top of it.
It certainly could be. I don't like to try to guess how these heads of officials handle these things and whether they are influenced by the fact that it's getting toward the playoff times and you don't want to, take guys out of a playoff game and all that stuff. But, that kicking a player when they're down is wrong. And whether the player was injured or not, I know that he came back later in the game, but that's irrelevant. You just can't do that in hockey. We don't see it much, but when you do, it really does stand out.
Well, some other things that stood out this weekend were some great games along the way. And, particularly on Friday night. It was a rare Friday night off for me, and I got to see the first leg of what was a weekend split between Penn State and Notre Dame.
And that was a heck of a battle and a great comeback for Notre Dame. At home, they're down both 3-0 and 4-1, and they start the comeback and end up tying the game before the midway point of the third period. So it wasn't a tie that you needed some last second goal. They got some momentum early in that third. They get the game tied, and then they go to overtime. And going back to bad penalties or egregious penalties, Penn State, they get called for a 5-minute major in the final minute of regulation. There was a scramble late that Notre Dame almost scored the game winner there. It wasn't until the first minute of overtime, though, and Notre Dame did indeed get that game winner. It locked up home ice for them in next week's Big Ten quarterfinals. And that obviously that alone is big because that they do draw very well at home. And I'm sure they'll have good playoff crowds. But, again, it's kind of crazy to think that in these big situations, that's a tied game. And it was Nikita Pilachev, who takes a contact to the head major with 53 seconds left in regulation. It shows that there's emotion left in these games, and emotion's good because if not, I think it makes the college game a little boring. But certainly the emotion boiled over in many circumstances this weekend.
Well, in the case of a big player, the risk of getting contact to the head penalties is a lot bigger because you've got your arms, your shoulders at the head level of other players often. So maybe unfortunate. One other thing I wanted to go back to in that game that was interesting was the use of replay early in the game. It looked as if Notre Dame had gotten on the scoreboard first and Penn State wanted it looked at. Well, then the linesman ends up going in the replay booth and determines that no, the entry was onside and there's no problem. And Guy Godowski for Penn State, the head coach, says, wait, that's not what we were complaining about. And they showed him, giving the signal for too many men. And they went back and looked. And indeed, Notre Dame had too many men, like 60 feet away from the play on a change on the other end. They waved off the goal. That's something that without replay never would have been looked at or suspected. But that did take the goal off, and I think changed the momentum for quite a bit of that game.
Yeah, I'm sure it did. And I remember seeing that. It's been a while since I've seen that called. And I do, if I'm right, they cannot give the delay a game penalty. All they can do is nullify the goal. It happened, and it was an inconsequential goal. The final score of the game was 5-0, I think. But it happened in an NCAA tournament game where a team was called for really an egregiously bad change, where one guy goes off at one end of the bench and another guy jumps into the play at the far end of the bench. And now that really affected, basically the manpower situation as this team went up ice. So you don't see it often, but it's good heads up. That means you have a really good hockey ops person that's communicating back to the bench, saying, I'm watching this video and here's what's happening. And, Guy Godowski, he knows the rules pretty well. My knowledge of him is that he knows this rule book, and he was able to take advantage of that knowledge and do, get the right referees to look at the right thing and make the right call.
Going to mention a couple other series before we break. One is the split on the weekend with Colorado College and North Dakota. A great performance by Colorado College on Friday night, particularly in the third period. But, CC has been towards the bottom since the formation of the NCHC, and Mike Haviland has been building that team, and they're moving in the right direction.
I've heard it said, I listened to Nate Ewell and Brad Schlossman's College Hockey Today podcast earlier this week, and they made the same indication that the one team nobody wants to play in the playoffs is likely Colorado College. They haven't always had results of late, but I go back to mid-January, 2 wins against Miami. Then they split at home against Minnesota Duluth. That's the number 3 team. They get a tie and a shootout loss, and then an overtime loss against St. Cloud State. Both of those games, they lost 2-goal leads, I believe, in the third period of both. They lose in overtime to Western Michigan, then they beat Western Michigan. Then they lose a 1-0 game to Denver. Then they beat North Dakota and lose a 1-goal game to North Dakota. So maybe the results aren't there. That's only 5 wins in an 11-12 game stretch. But every single game that they're not winning, they're right there. They're in. The only lopsided loss of that whole stretch was a 6-0 loss to Minnesota Duluth. So I wouldn't want to, playoff hockey, if you have teams that can get leads and hang around games and all that sort of stuff, they become the most dangerous underdogs. I don't even call this team too much of an underdog. And there's some play that's going to go on next week to figure out who's seated where in that conference as their playoffs don't start for 2 more weekends. But I would not want to be playing Colorado College in that best-of-3 series. And
if you want to really think about how fun this would be, if the standings remain as they are right now after next weekend, Colorado College would be playing at Denver.
I mean, we were talking a little bit about some of the rivalries. Niagara and Canisius are going to play in the first round in Atlantic hockey, and Michigan, Minnesota, they're going to play in the Big Ten. I mean, Denver, Colorado College. I mean, you already played 4 times, and literally that would be 3 series in the span, or 5 games that they would end up playing each other, minimum, maybe 6 if it goes to 3 games. So it could be as many as 6 games played in a span of about 20 days, because they had a makeup game last Tuesday night against Denver. They'll close their regular season against Denver, and then could face them in the first round of the playoffs. So even the thought that they could play 5 straight games against them, with 2 on the end here in the regular and then 3 in a best-of-3 series, that's pretty crazy as well.
Well, still to come, a look at the ECAC, some teams that are really hot right now, and a look at the PairWise. That's coming up after this word from our friends at the NCAA Frozen Four, April 11th and 13th at KeyBank Center in Buffalo.
Speed and precision, unrelenting power. This trophy is not given, it must be earned. The 2019 NCAA Frozen Four, April 11th and 13th at KeyBank Center in Buffalo.
With a shot. Saved by Morris. Takes the shot. Retired!
Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 and get your tickets today.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review Podcast. I'm Ed Trefzger with Jim Connelly. In the ECAC, it was a wild finish. Now, there are 12 teams in the league. The playoff format is the top 4 teams get a first-round bye, while the bottom 8 play down to 4. And it took very late in the game to decide the final standings in the game between Cornell and Clarkson.
Yeah, you went into Saturday night with a pretty crazy situation where Cornell was in first place. 1 point behind them was both Harvard and Quinnipiac, and then 2 points behind was Clarkson, and Clarkson, of course, was playing Cornell at home. Quinnipiac's situation was wrapped up. They had taken that lead about midway through the game and ended up being a 3 or 4 goal lead, and they were comfortable. We knew that they were going to win. Harvard, on the other hand, was struggling. They ended up losing to Union. They were down 4-2, midway through the third period. It ended up being a 4-3 final. They scored in the final minute. But here you had Cornell, and they were clinging to a 2, and I really mean clinging to a 2-1 lead against Clarkson. And just one of those types of moments. Clarkson had dominated the game but couldn't find the back of the net. And then finally, with 42.5 seconds left, they get the tying goal. That sent everything into a frenzy, because if you now know that if it's a tie, you have co-champions, and Quinnipiac is going to be the number 1 seed. You could have had Clarkson win it, and they would have jumped up, and they would have been tied. But Quinnipiac then would have had the championship to themselves. Of course, Cornell could have won in overtime. It ended up being a tie. The team that probably kicks themselves the most out of all this is Harvard, because they went from having a share of the ECAC title, the Clary Cup, to falling to a tie for third in the 4th seed in the playoffs. So the team that really benefited, obviously, was Quinnipiac, because they needed help and they got it in the last second goal by Clarkson. But Harvard, on the other hand, it was a missed opportunity, and they drop all the way down to 4th.
Well, certainly getting into the top 4 is good to have the first round bye. That's also the format in Atlantic hockey, and all that stuff was settled yesterday as well. But let's talk about some of the teams who are really hot right now. And the one that jumps out at the top of the list, because they had such a great weekend, although it took overtime twice, is Wisconsin. 3 wins in a row, and they swept Michigan on the weekend.
Yeah, I really think that that was a necessary weekend for Wisconsin. They needed to get themselves some real confidence. I heard their coach kind of giving a post-game speech after Friday, and he had hoped that I think they could get themselves into a position maybe for home ice in the next round. It didn't work out that way, and they will play. I believe they'll head now to Penn State for next weekend's game. Michigan State will go to Notre Dame, and Michigan will travel to Minnesota. But when they've won 3 games in a row, and they both of their wins this week, kind of dramatic overtime wins, that gives you a little bit of nice momentum heading into the playoffs. And even go back to the end of their season here, they had a couple of lopsided losses, but the number of times they just lost in overtime or lost a 1-goal game late, it just felt like there was a lot of those types of games. So they're hanging around games. They're playing probably their best hockey they have all season, and they will be a very dangerous team for Penn State. Obviously, Penn State, we know they can score, but if Wisconsin can play a little bit of defense, they have the chance to score the goals as well, and that's been something they've been doing of late.
When you have a team with momentum like that, and a team where they're building confidence and where they're getting better and getting better, they may not yet have peaked.
No, and listen, when you're trying to say, okay, yeah, they're the 6 out of 7 seed in the playoffs, sure, that's right, but they literally finished 1 game out of second place. They were 3 points behind Notre Dame. You reverse any one loss in the season, and you're suddenly in second place in this league. And this is a pretty good Wisconsin team. We've talked about it a number of times in this podcast, and I feel like there's was a lot of cannibalization in the regular season where teams in the Big Ten were killing teams in the Big Ten. And when you look at that 2nd through 6th spot in the standings, all 5 teams in there are separated by 3 points. That's a lot, and this is a 3-point per game league. So this was a game or less was everybody from 2 to 6. So you realize that this is pretty tight, and anybody's going to be able to beat anybody in this Big Ten tournament.
You look across college hockey, and right now there are probably only legitimately 4 or 5 not very good teams. Just about everybody else can play with anybody else.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, I look at the teams aren't going to play in their own conference postseason. And the ones I can really talk about are the Hockey East teams. Those 3 teams, Merrimack, Yukon, and Vermont, all were pretty good, but they lacked something that the top 8 teams in Hockey East have. So you're finding that sometimes eliminating a couple of teams, it's sensible. But even Atlantic Hockey, Canisius, I thought that they were a pretty dangerous team at times down the stretch and pulled off a couple of upsets. And here they are in last place in their league, and they'll make the playoffs. But there have been a couple of teams out there, and I'd have to pull up the final standings to see them all. But I'm trying to think of some good bottom of the barrel or bottom end teams and leagues that were scary. Obviously Michigan State in a 7-team league, I don't concern myself that much. RPI, I saw earlier in the year, and I thought they were an excellent team. That didn't materialize on paper. They finished 11th in the ECAC. They'll be a tough opponent. The NCHC, would anybody really want to play Miami in the playoffs and think that they're going to have a cakewalk? It's just not going to happen, But that Miami right now tied for the last spot, and then the WCHA. Obviously, we've eliminated Ferris and Alaska Anchorage, but Alabama Huntsville, the number 8 seed, they just knocked off Bowling Green on Friday night. And I mean, I know that they fell convincingly on Saturday, but you just kind of don't know. You're right that there just weren't that many really bad teams this year in college hockey.
And when you get down to playoffs, even in a best of 3 series, if you split the first 2 games, then all of a sudden game 3 is a single elimination game. And things happen in single elimination that are different, even if it's a best of 3 series. You could have a best of 7 series in the NHL, and it comes down to the last game and just throw everything out the window. So I wouldn't want to face anybody that has a risk of being dangerous in the playoffs. You just have to play who you get.
Yeah, I mean, I look around and, maybe St. Lawrence isn't that good and Dartmouth gets them in the playoffs, and maybe that's one of the series that I can kind of see being a bit of a blowaway. But I just don't see the other ones. Listen, there's also the possibility that some of the top teams just really kick into gear. When St. Cloud State, they've been so dominant, they get into the playoffs against either Miami or Omaha. Maybe they just dominate them because they are just so good. But it's not going to be because those bottom teams just aren't good. Because I think that, like I said, some of the real bottom teams in college hockey have been eliminated already in Hockey East and the WCHA.
When you look at some of the leagues, like, for example, Colgate at Union or Holy Cross at Robert Morris or Michigan State at Notre Dame, none of those are going to be gimmies. Even though you've got lower teams, you've got teams that have been building some momentum towards the end of the season.
Yeah, the Michigan State Notre Dame one is one that really stands out to me because Michigan State had a couple of good wins down the stretch, and Notre Dame has been consistently inconsistent in conference play. Even to the fact that they had the dramatic win on Friday night and then come back and lose on Saturday. Ohio State was the last win for Michigan State. That's a pretty good win to kind of hang your hat on. And they beat Penn State a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now. So I don't think that there's an easy out in that playoffs at all. I don't think there's many easy outs right now in any of the 6 conference playoffs.
Let's touch on quickly some teams that are pretty hot right now. Probably nobody hotter than St. Cloud.
Yeah, an 8-game unbeaten streak. They have done everything to solidify their position. The PairWise, they look like they'll be the number 1 team when the tournament starts in a few weeks. They strangely lose one of their comparisons in the PairWise to Union because they actually played head-to-head and lost and thus lose the comparison. So they're going to probably be tied with UMass for the number of comparisons won at the end, but there's no way that I think RPI-wise, the way that St. Cloud has played and the limited number of potential losses they have going forward, there's no way that St. Cloud is going to drop in RPI below UMass. So to me, it looks like St. Cloud is very close to sewing up the number 1 seed. They are just red hot, and they really are playing their best hockey in a very good year. They're playing their best hockey right down the stretch.
They had the number 1 seed last year and didn't make it past the first round of the NCAAs. I'm sure that Brett Larson will want to correct that. Let's look at the Hockey East situation. 2 teams hot right now are Providence and BU. Providence has already sewn up home ice for the Hockey East playoffs, and Boston University has the opportunity. They're going to be at Maine this week.
Yeah, and they're going to need some help. They're going to need probably Vermont to beat or tie Lowell to get to that spot, because a win for Lowell would likely sew things up. There's some other ways that BU can get some help from other people. Brian Smith from the league office sent out a scenarios page today, and it was literally small type. Every single space on that page was filled with potential scenarios, because only besides the bottom 3 in the league, only one spot has been locked up, and that is UMass being the number 1 seed. Everything else is up for grabs. But BU has done a good job of sticking with it. It looked pretty dire for them. They've had to continue to win down the stretch here, and I think they're unbeaten in 5, just to be in a position to go into next weekend knowing that they can get that home ice if they can get that win up in Maine.
Let's take one quick look at the PairWise rankings before we wrap up. Interesting to me, and it's, of course, the math, and I'm sure if I looked underneath the numbers, Arizona State stays at number 8 in the PairWise despite being swept by Minnesota, although that did help the Gophers get up to number 20.
Yeah, and I'm assuming, I think that they're between 8 and 9 right now, but there's a good lip between both Arizona State and Providence that are tied with a .5505 RPI. And there's probably more decimal places that's putting Arizona State ahead of Providence. That's my guess. And then Clarkson, which is the team behind them, at .5497. So right now, I think that Arizona State is still very secure. They're not falling below 10 before the end of the season. And this weekend, because they played a Minnesota team that has actually been surging, they're all the way up to tied for 20. This weekend, as much as you would have thought, did not hurt the Sun Devils.
And looking at this, ECAC has an opportunity to get 4 teams in to the tournament based on the PairWise right now. Clarkson, Cornell and Harvard kind of on the edge, but Quinnipiac up there. Right now, there would be 4 teams, and as Rand Pecknold told us the other day, maybe another one gets in there, depending on who wins the tournament.
Yeah, that's not a likely scenario, because it would require either Cornell or Harvard being eliminated along the way. And I think any loss for those teams could be detrimental, especially if it was Harvard. They might fall below the bubble. And then that 4th team would actually be, the upset that what would be perceived as a 5th team would be the upset that could stir the apple cart, and the collateral damage would likely be an ECAC team. So I'm not bullish on the fact that ECAC can even get 5. The math has got to put that as under a 1% chance. But 4 is possible, and you just have to hope that if 2 of these teams, say Cornell and Harvard, or Clarkson and Harvard, had to play each other, and if it was Harvard that fell in that game, or Cornell Harvard, if they're head to head, either one of them falls in that game, then they drop out of the tournament because of just the fluctuation. But you don't know, it is so much is going to depend on what happens around you. Obviously, when you have Western Michigan and Notre Dame kind of chasing, those are 2 teams that are going to be playing strong opponents. So they're going to have an opportunity to really boost their RPI. You might not have that same quarterfinal boost ability that both Western and Notre Dame, even Penn State, you can throw into that mix as well. So it'll be interesting to watch, but it could be a banner year in terms of placing the teams in for the ECAC. The tough thing is what they can do when they get there. The other one I do want to point out is how close Quinnipiac is to potentially getting themselves into a number 1 seed position. If anything falters for Minnesota State and Quinnipiac can stay hot and keep winning games, they could then jump past Minnesota State into that 4th place in the PairWise, and then the final number 1 seed when it's Selection Sunday.
Well, certainly the Bobcats will be helped by whoever they will face in the ECAC playoffs. And at this point, probably not hurt because they'll adjust the RPI. But things are looking very strong. Rand Pecknold said this season is above expectations. They've exceeded what were already high expectations for the season. And after the only sub 500 season in his tenure, to come back where they are right now at 25-7-2 is remarkable.
It certainly is. And, and this weekend proved a lot, I'm sure, to them that they could go in and play the two games that they had to win them both. And in doing so, capture the regular season title, get the number one seed in the tournament, and now put themselves in their best. You're in a very good position when you're the number one overall seed in the tournament. You're going to get the lowest remaining seed in the quarterfinals. If there happens to be an upset, that would be lower than 8. That's pretty good. And then, you obviously have home ice, last change, all of that stuff once you're in the conference finals up in Lake Placid.
One other thing on the PairWise, we like to talk about teams getting to 20 or 21 wins, meaning they're in the tournament. But this is where it also points out the necessity of having a good non-conference record for your league. And I look at two teams with 21 wins, number 17 in the PairWise Bowling Green and number 22 in the PairWise Lake Superior. They are probably going to have to win the WCHA to get in. Yeah,
it's tough. It's tough for them, And then you look at the other side of it, and you see a team with 17 wins in Cornell. You see a team with 19 wins in Denver, and they're set. They can literally not win another game in Denver. I think right now is in the tournament. So they could have 19 wins and get in. Then you have teams like Bowling Green and Lake State with 21. They're not going to, and they could probably get up to 22 or 23 or 24 and maybe possibly not make this tournament. I always said 23 was kind of the magical number. Once you get to 23, you're usually safe. But we're in a position this year with the WCHA and kind of the weak overall conference RPI where you could have teams get to 24 and miss this tournament.
Well, Jim, that'll wrap it up for this week's edition of the Weekend Review podcast. We'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.